This is the fourth and final part on global freshwater resources. Um, let's talk generally about what happens with construction of dams, reservoirs, and water diversions, and let's talk about that from a global perspective. There's a lot of similar efforts going on in China. I mean, despite what's happened in the United States, upon construction of dams, even knowing the ecological ramifications of that at global scale, similar effort keeps going, keeps happening despite knowing the consequences. So China, one of the most recent efforts in water diversion is South Water North Diversion Project. It kind of literally means water that's flowing southward in China in major rivers are now rerouted back to the industrial scale crop farms in the northern parts of the country. So it actually includes three irrigation canals that will reroute water from Yangtze River, one of the largest rivers in China, to the northern parts of the country. A similar project is the Three Gorges Dam, which again is based off Yangtze River of China, which involves construction of three major dams and thus three major reservoirs, um, impounding the flow of Yangtze River, which, by the way, is already impounded and under massive levels of modification and receiving many other environmental impacts. So, with this project, there will be 13 cities, 140 small towns slash villages, over 1,600 um, small human settlements, which we call villages, will be submerged completely. Um, Under the existing dams that they have already constructed, similar or more impacts have already been um, recorded. So, and with this dam construction, about 103 million people have been relocated from their original settlements. The problem here is not about what's happening to people or these towns or villages or cities, who give us dam to them. The problem is, when you relocate these people, when you recreate cities, towns, or villages elsewhere, you have to alter the natural land cover. You could be looking at loss of natural vegetation. Um, there are very critical ecosystems in the southern China, and as well as in the western part of the country, which includes temperate forests, and very unique habitats. There are a couple of biodiversity hotspots that at least partly overlaps with or partly extends into China. So what will happen to those unique habitats, unique ecosystems? What are those unique wetlands, those semi-arid ecosystems? All of those are under perilment when you relocate this many people. And well, even the infrastructure that has been constructed, like dams, have been reported to have cracks already because those river systems, those large river systems, are not meant to be impounded. The water volume is too large to sustain dams intact for a long time frame. It has resulted in landslides all over this very steepy slopes, and in certain sections of the rivers as well as in reservoir, algal blooming and eutrophication has been reported many times in different seasons. Um, Up to today, in River Yangtze, about two River Yangtze, over nearly 300 billion gallons of untreated raw sewage has been dumped without any level of treatments, which actually is what that primarily leads to algal blooming and similar problems. And currently the river can keep flushing down this raw untreated sewage and other urban effluvia that's been directly dumped to Yangtze without any treatment. But if you construct these dams and provided the existing dams that they have already that already exist, it will prevent movement of these pollutants, and that will stagnate pollutants within the river system. So that makes me question whether some of those reservoirs can actually help um, sustain some of the water demand for public use. Think about the sanitary conditions that would arise from this. And right now, there are over 1,600 factories, mines that are abandoned within the coast or in proximity to the flow of Yangtze River. If you create this impoundment, it's actually going to inundate um, tens and thousands of hectares of land upstream of the dam. And think about what will happen to all of those mines and factories. They will get submerged, and all those heavy metals, all the pollutants, those um, that are present within these factories and mines will become resuspended in water, and that water will be unusable. At least you have to keep flushing these reservoirs, many times to get rid of that. Even if you were to flush it, where would you flush these toxicants? Right? Flush it to the river? That's not going to work. um so Yangtze River, is itself an aquatic biodiversity hotspot. There are many endemic mammals, freshwater mammals, cetaceans, birds, fish occupying that river course. Right? What will happen to those unique species? Right? These problems are not only unique to China. I bring about the problem in China because there is a huge movement happening in China, despite the outcry from environmental scientists. Well, the problem is not endemic to China. Similar stuff happening in India. There are 30 or more dams that are already constructed in Narmada River of India. And again, think about this displacement that it results in. Again, I really don't care where these Indians are being going to be relocated to, whether they will be relocated. I don't care. You know, the problem is if when you relocate, that results in a massive change in the habitat structure, right? You have to clear rainforests in India or those temperate deciduous forests, those seasonal monsoon forests, or those unique grasslands. One way or the other, existing ecosystems has to suffer to relocate these idiots that has been relocated, that have been displaced. That's my concern. Don't care what happened to the people. And you might consider, well, constructing reservoir creates novel habitats. True, well, but in particularly in parts of India where they are constructing this reservoir, they don't have natural still water systems. India doesn't have a geological history for most of the country. Well, maybe in the northern part, in the Himalayas and the foothills, they might have some geological influence, some glacial influenced formation of still water systems, but not where they are putting up reservoirs. No, in India as a tropical country, they mostly have is flowing water systems. So these constructed reservoirs are not going to provide any habitat for most of the natural fauna and flora. Well, some of the birds might be able to occupy, but then again, the deep water habitat in a reservoir, well, that's not going to help any native fauna or flora in India, right? If there are similar problems have been observed in areas where they construct reservoirs that have had a glaciation past. So in areas that does not have that kind of glacier formation, well, those habitats are not going to help anything, right? It actually inundates land. It inundates and destroys ripened environment. It inundates the entire floodplain. So it keeps actually destroying more habitats through inundation. It doesn't create any habitats. So this slide actually kind of summarizes some of the problems that you encounter with construction of reservoirs. So it actually tells you the advantages and disadvantages. So advantages wise, well, yeah, it provides some irrigation water or potable water or consumable water because it creates a reservoir, a holding water system upstream of the dam. And then, yeah, there might be some nature-based recreation activities associated with fishing and boating, and that kind of could provide some sort of could generate some conservation dollars for natural resource management and acquiring more conservation lands for active management. Because when you have fishing operations going on or hunting operations going on in the reservoir catchment, you could issue hunting licenses and fishing licenses, so that generates some money. Okay. And also produces electricity. In this slide it says can produce cheap electricity. Well, That's very subjective. Yeah, maybe it's cheaper than through producing electricity via combusting fossil fuels or through wind or something like that. But that's subjective. Like there could be other alternative ways to generate hydroelectricity with minimal environmental impact. Maybe it is cheap with respect to the maintenance, right? The construction of this dam is not cheap. Um, so yeah, it will produce hydroelectricity, but at what cost? Or at what environmental cost is my question. Is it even sustainable? If you don't manage the catchment properly, this reservoir could quickly lose its capacity, going below what you need to effectively generate electricity through hydropower. And since the reservoir holds water and reduces downstream discharge, it could actually protect downstream towns and habitats and human settlements from flooding. But a better way to do that is to manage the floodplain across the entire watershed, across the entire basin, um, is much more effective and lasting way to protect cities and towns and human settlements and infrastructure from flooding. Reservoir is a patch. It's not going to be a sustainable solution. In terms of problem, so this because of the inundation upstream of the dam, it destroys forests, wetlands, riparian corridors, riparian habitats, floodplains, and many other wetlands. Right. So many habitats are replaced by one single type of a unnatural habitat. That's what I want to call it. And then because it's a huge open water system with little to no vegetation cover, the evapotranspirative loss of vegetation is massive. Rather than being discharging downstream and kind of supporting water to the floodplain, filling the floodplain and supporting water to the wetlands and other nearby natural aquatic habitats, you lose water through evapotranspiration. It's unavoidable in reservoir system. And um, and also it deprives the downstream water supply to other aquatic habitats like at the river mouth, like deltas, estuaries, lagoons, and other coastal water habitats. And some coastal wetlands are dependent on the sediment flux, the nutrient flux, and water flow. So now, and in longer, those habitats will not receive this material and energy that is necessary to keep those ecosystems productive. Not to mention some of those coastal water ecosystems associated with the river flow, river mouth are extremely productive and extremely diverse. And the history has taught us many lessons that those dams has to undergo rigorous testing and rigorous renovations and repairing. If you don't do it, any um, failure to do so will result in major damage to the downstream human infrastructure. And it prevents, the conventional dams do not have any fish ladders or any ways to allow aquatic animals to passage through, so it will disrupt migration patterns, movement patterns of fish. There are many fish like Atlantic sturgeon, herring, salmon that migrates across river, eels, diadromas, which both catadromas and anadromas that migrates back and forth between freshwater and marine habitats, or freshwater and coastal habitats, or coastal and freshwater habitats for the purpose of reproduction to complete some sort of their life history stages. With this impoundment, well, that's not going to be a possibility. So to elaborate a little bit more of these problems, yes, it does retain the surface runoff, right? And surface runoff contains more than water. It contains water, silt, sediment, and nutrients that requires to sustain downstream ecosystems. Um, and it kind of increases the dam construction increases retention time or the residential time of surface water within the river channel. um, in the United States there are about 75,000 large major dams that retains half of the river flow. Now that kind of enhanced residential time of water in a flowing water system is a major ecosystem change. It's a major change in the kinetic energy, major change in the ecosystem dynamics, right? Nutrient flow dynamics in those systems, right? And then again, of course, it has displayed nearly 80 million people, throughout different river basins in the country. Again, my problem is, those people will be relocated by, at the expense of other unique critical habitat types. Um, and the post dam discharge, below dam discharge, is going to be always lower, right, unless you have a dam that actually manages to keep at something closer to historical discharge. But all over the United States, it's extremely unlikely for you to keep it, right? So post dam, you get these flashy conditions where you get unpredictable, untimely, unseasonal peaks in discharge, um, when the dam releases its water, right? So you're going to see massive changes in flow regimes downstream, right? Of course, first it decreases the flow, decreases the volume discharge downstream, and then it actually creates spikes. Whenever the water is released, you get a spike, right? That creates so much disturbances below the dam. Certain native biota may not be able to adapt to that, but instead you might actually recruit some invasive species that are highly adapted to withstand high degree of flashy, um, spiking disturbances happening below a dam. So yes, like I mentioned, freshwater fish and plants, the establishment of establishment of plants along riparian banks happens when there's a continuous water flow, because it's actually that water flow that carries propagates and seeds to establish and colonize downstream habitats. If you check the water flow, there will be no colonization of vegetation, right? Fish do move for not even the diadromous fish, even freshwater fish tends to move back and forth from one tributary to the main stem, from main stem to another tributary, for a variety of functions, mostly for breeding associated movements, for foraging, for nursing purposes, for nest construction, for reproduction. Now, this will prevent that kind of activities from happening. But I did mention the problem with diadromous and amphidromous fish, right? They will never be able to reach back their native breeding grounds. And the same thing regarding estuarine and marine species that depends on the nutrient flux, sediment flux from the stream will lose those essential critical resources with the impoundments, right? And dam construction will also prevent migration or movement between two subpopulations. So that actually barriers meta-population and meta-community dynamics that will reduce the gene flow, and that actually will make those individual isolated subpopulation less adaptive. Um, and then with the construction of reservoir, upstream of the reservoir, with the inundation, it will actually destroy or kind of smother spawning habitats, because the sediments will deposit on the river bottom, and and that will destroy spawning habitats. There are certain species spawn on the river banks, on the shallow water undercut bank conditions. With flooding, you lose those characteristic, unique undercut bank environments right next to the river bank. So those species will also lose suitable spawning grounds. Um, with the construction of a dam, you see dramatic reduction in the flow, right? So what about the species that are adapted to fast flowing water, where you get high dissolved oxygen concentrations and cooler water, right? So you are looking at massive changes in physical and chemical properties of water, right, with dam construction. And also with the dam construction upstream, you actually retain a reservoir, so it prevents flooding, so you will not have a floodplain anymore. The same thing regarding downstream. There's not enough water to support flooding below the dam, so that also destroys the floodplain environment. So with flood suppression, that creates other problems, regarding vegetation colonization and wetland dynamics when you suppress flooding, because flooding is a natural disturbance that you require to maintain floodplain ecosystems, and there are many other species that depends on this floodplain dynamics. Like there are certain fish and invertebrates that may actually use the flooding to reach floodplain habitats for safer breeding grounds. But now those animals cannot actually reach those breeding grounds. That will create collapsing in their populations. Even very robust populations without opportunity for reproduction can easily collapse. So 21 of 177 world's longest rivers run dry prior to to their delta because there's not enough water to sustain the loading system all the way to the sea. Um, and with the impeded water flow, it retains sediments, silt, mud, and other suspended particles. Um, and that will actually kind of raises the bottom of the reservoir and make the reservoir essentially dysfunctional or doesn't hold enough water to support any of the intended functions, right? um, so as a result, within the United States, between 1976 to 2014, actually more towards the 2014, over 1,000 dams have been removed. In Massachusetts, with the Department of Ecological Restoration, they are having a major plan to remove some of the dams, right? And in fact, some of the dams we have in the Northeast are meant for the historical mills. We don't have mills anymore, so why the heck we keep these dams? Right? And it's a huge risk because most of those dams are 100 years old. We don't know when they're going to give away. Right? I mean, if you have visited some of those historical dams, you can see how unstable the dam itself is. Right? The bricks are coming up. You can push those bricks with your fingers, and they will, like collapse. So we need to remove about a huge proportion of dams in Massachusetts. There is no need for most of the smaller dams we have around here, right? So 85% of the US dams are over 50 years old, and most of them are not serving a particular function unless you worry about some historical value because of those historical mills. You're looking at an impeding disaster, and no one knows when it will happen. Um, and think about the other broadcast impacts with climate change. There's less water, right? So there's less flood risks, but the water stress will aggravate, particularly downstream, right? And to the right side, you're looking at different species that are impacted by impoundments that require continuity of the stream for their movements. You're looking at sturgeons, steelheads, several species of trouts, Atlantic salmon, strip mullet. There are many species that, like there are too many species that I cannot mention. Now, remember that some of these fish I'm talking about have an economical value. Those are, actually, part of the recreational fishery in the United States. So there is a social impact to dam construction, that actually relates a lot to the, American traditions of fishing and hunting. So, associated with the Colorado River's delta system and its river mouth, from the point which actually turns into a estuarine complex, right? Um, we used to have about 2 million acres of delta associated wetland systems. That includes coastal forests, coastal scrublands, grasslands, um, lagoons and estuarine systems, tidal marshes, coastal marshes. Now, all of those ecosystems, are no longer sustainable. They will, gradually they are declining in their acreage because the massive river of Colorado now is nothing but a tiny, sluggish river that even does not run perennially. So here I'm actually showing you before and after changes in the landscape and in the local habitat before and after construction of a particular dam. Right, you're looking at 4 different scenarios. So in Paraguay Parana River, the dam was constructed in 1985, right? So this is before and after. And you can see how much terrestrial forest cover has been lost to make this large reservoir. Look how before what you see. Well, what you see over here is actually a braiding river system. It looks like the braided hair, right? And if you look little closely, you can see that a single river channel has multiple smaller channels in it. So that kind of situation you call that anastomosing river systems. It actually creates a greater diversity in the habitat heterogeneity. So it's not a simple flowing river, right? It's actually a much more complex, meandering river that undergoes, geological phenomena known as grading or anastomosing. And you see all the complexities over here. But now that is replaced by a single stagnant, deep body of water, right? And then you look at the Lake Mills. Again, you can see once it was a flowing system, now it's a stagnant system, right? And now look at the bottom pictures, right? First, the Chilean dam, you can see how bigger the valley really is, right? It's an extremely large, broad, low-lying valley. But now, because of the dam construction, the downstream flow is limited to a very small ditch of water, right? And you can see the entire riparian beds have been exposed, right? There is no vegetation growing over here. Imagine the amount of erosion and landslides that could happen because of this situation. Um, and then the look at how much lands have been lost or forest deforestation have happened along the river banks after the Three Gorges Dam is constructed, particularly over here, if you follow my point. So there's a massive level of landscape scale, ecosystem modification, habitat loss happening because of dam construction. Okay, so what about the upstream of the dam? Do you think that's going to actually be viable? I kept saying it's not sustainable. Look at what happens at the Lake Powell, which is constructed on um, the Colorado River, right? So in 2002, you can see how much the inundation is, but in 2003, a year later, look how much has the river dried down, has the reservoir dried down. It has dried down all the way to an older river canal, right? So the point being, maybe this kind of an environment is not meant for construction of reservoir, right? Like because of this, like xeric dry uplands, like the sedimentation and erosion and then deposition of that in the lake bed and raising the lake bed is inevitable. So if you look at the Lake Mead system to the right, in 1983, you can see how much the water level is, and look at 2007, how much those poles have been, exposed, right? And how much water level has declined. So, maybe, like these reservoirs, these dams are not even meeting what is expected in terms of socio-economical benefits. So now we are looking at the Aral Sea, right? It's actually located in Central Asia. You can see it's kind of it's the position, geographical position. It's in kind of saddles between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. In Central Asia, right? You're looking at kind of the parts sort of below the Russia. And I believe, now my political science knowledge is not that great. I believe this used to be at least part of the former Soviet Union. But nonetheless, I just wanted you to know where ROC is. So it has been shrinking. The size of the surface area of the water holding capacity of that particular water body has been going down since 1960s. So what is called Aral Sea, it was a freshwater habitat. It's a freshwater body. It's quote unquote inland sea, right? So it's not freshwater, not marine water, not saline water, not brackish water. It's freshwater. It's a freshwater lake. Um, so there are two rivers. If you see the smaller image, right? There are two rivers that is feeding into the Aral Sea. That is actually why it remains as a freshwater habitat. So those two rivers have then been, like after 1976, around 1980s or so, has been diverted into farmlands to grow cotton and rice elsewhere, right? So which actually reduced the water supply to the Aral Sea. And ultimately, that sea lost its primary water inlet, and by 2009, the Aral Sea lost about 90% of its water volume, right? And it becomes, like a barren, dry desert. So what is left behind is actually when what do you think? What is left over when water evaporates, right? Well, the salt doesn't evaporate. The salt remains there, right? And it's surrounded by drier um, desert-like environments. So there's a lot of surface runoff dumping salts, minerals into the riverbed. So that salines, the source remained, the water was lost by evaporative loss. There's no flux of fresh water to keep the salinity down anymore. So what is left behind is a dry basin of salty desert. The salinity of that particular environment in these smaller water bodies that is still remaining is about 7 times higher than that of seawater. So the original habitat, if you look at the photograph, aerial photograph from 1976, the immediate surrounding of the lake was covered by different variety of wetlands that was occupied by wildlife. 85% of that wetland has been lost, right? And there was a capture fishery industry that has completely collapsed today because there has no fish to catch now with this much of salinity in the remaining water bodies. Um, and well, is that the end of the environmental problem? No. Now you have a dry, salty basin, right? And the wind picked up the salt, and the wind was blowing, southwards towards the Himalayan mountains, so that the wind picks up the salt, deposited that in the Himalayan range. Well, guess what happened when you put salt on snow? Well, why do you think we put road salts on our highways during snowstorms? Well, to melt them, to melt the ice, to melt the snow. So the same thing happened on top of Himalayas. Glaciers started to melt, right? And this particular water body is actually among the largest freshwater water bodies in the entire Central Asian realm. So there was a lot of local climate moderation, happening within that area. It actually supplied water through evaporation to create rain locally, right? So it actually led to a massive change in the local climate, right? There's no, not, this is a landlocked area. So the only thing that actually moderates the climate extremities in landlocked regions is large water bodies that moderates the regional climate. Well, now there is no moderation, so you immediately start experiencing massive changes in the climate of the Central Asian area. Um, this is not the end of the problem, right? When you have a salty dust, suspended in the air, people breathe that. So that led to respiratory issues. Well, that salts also contaminated drinking water system. So it led to kidney failures and liver failure. So it actually escalated into a health problem. So desalination, right, of seawater is actually how most of the major cities, coastal cities, and particularly major cities in the Middle East gain their potable water, right? They remove salts out of seawater, right? Happening in California, happening in Middle East. So that is actually the city of Dubai. It's a Middle Eastern, extremely rich, extremely well developed city, right? It's actually built literally on the desert. It's an engineering marvel if you study and read about how these buildings were constructed in an unstable desert sand. It's unbelievable, right? But what are the consequences of these kind of constructions creating a city out of nothing, right? Particularly with respect to water supply, right? Imagine how much dust storms blows through this city, and imagine how they clean those building of the after the dust storm, right? By actually spraying water across these buildings, right? I mean, think about how much water it takes, right? And the cooling systems in these buildings are also primarily driven by water. um and what I want you to do is read about the problems of desalination. In previous slides, I think in the same lecture topic, in a previous slide, I did explain the consequences, but I want to specifically research more about that and understand the negative impacts of seawater desalination and how it impacts at the point of desalination. I mean, think about what's the problem when you extract so much seawater from the ocean, right? Are there impacts in that situation? Well, don't think about of removing water. I mean, oceans are a massive water reservoir, right? But it's not extraction of water itself. I mean, when you extract water, what you are extracting with it? Some of those pumping systems are so powerful. It draws some of the um, fish larvae with that. It could destroy some of the bottom water habitats, right? It could actually create unnecessary disturbances throughout the water column. um, and think about what you do with the salt water sludge you generate with this, right? So do some research on your own to understand the impacts of desalination. Now let's talk about some of the benefits or the efficiencies of the modern irrigation systems, right? Now this drip irrigation and center pivot irrigation are much more advanced or modern, yet simple irrigation system. So in the drip irrigation, the water comes through this central pipe, then goes to this smaller like circular pipes, right? And then underside of these circular pipelines, water drips slowly, bit by bit, drop by drop, through the soil. Like it's not sprayed on, right? It's actually dropped. So it adds minimal water as needed into the soil. If you look at the central pivot irrigation system, happens. So it's a sprinkler system. So usual traditional sprinklers spread water against gravity, but center pivot systems um, pumps water towards gravity, so it actually minimizes water droplets being dispersed to untargeted locations, and it kind of pivots. So the same um, radially this radius like pipe actually keeps pivoting around the center rather than having many different sprinklers all over the farm field. It's the same system actually adding water, um, and it preserves water level, right? The efficiency is pretty high, as you can see in the descriptions. So there has been some, in western part of the states, California, Oregon, Washington. In that area, there has been some new movements to integrate farming systems with conservation, right? So in fact, there has been certain statewide agreements drafted between the government, conservation agencies, and the private landowners, where lands are managed for multiple purposes: conservation, water resources management, and food production. So I'm going to explain very briefly what these things are. Land banking is a system where farmers may decide to let some of their farming lands fallow during dry years. Rather than keep farming, they actually let it fallow. So it actually helps some level of nitrogen fixation, and provide some transient habitats for wildlife, provide some habitats for pollinators, and also some habitats for certain wildlife to hunker down to estivate. Walking wetlands. So in that under that system, farmers may flood fields on a rotational basis to create temporary wetlands, right? So during that season, when they flood the farms, they actually crop something that can withstand flooding and soil saturation. But the flooded lands also helps recruit wildlife, waterfowls, right? So, so in this situation, the farmers have to kind of plan ahead of the time, um, depending on the time that wetlands are needed for migrating birds, and also pick a particular crop that can fit in flooded conditions in that particular season. So you have to plan ahead of the time. It's not impossible. You just have to have help from agrarian scientists and botanists to make decisions regarding what crop to pick, and and then also to do the timing. Now, because of this novel farming strategy, funding that was earlier dedicated at federal or state level, that is driven towards land management by private land trusts, now can also be allocated for farmers. So then farmers can actually manage their lands to satisfy multiple needs. Um, so thereby farmers get economical incentives from the state or federal governments, and sometimes even from fairly affluent non-profits. And these kind of incentives could include direct payments from the government for the wise use of water resources and land management. Also, how to manage land. Getting like kind of free advices, um, scientific consultation for sound management of the land. And that kind of approaches also preserve sustainability of the farmland to keep it under production for a longer period of time. So, this is an interesting practice that has been happening in the recent few years in the arid southwestern US, Australia, and other dry Mediterranean countries. So, historically, those areas that are dry and arid, for the purpose of landscaping, home gardening, for managing industrial parks, for managing, backyards, schoolyards, they actually use water demanding horticultural products, right? Like exotic grasses, exotic lawning grasses, exotic flowers. But now there's a trend towards using native flowers that actually requires absolutely no water, extra water, right? And they can survive perfectly well within the native soil. There is no need to manage soil. And all you need is seeding, and it's native. It's part of the ecosystem, so it actually increases the effective habitat area available for native fauna as well as flora. So it's a really interesting movement and it has been quite successful. And even if you travel sites right now in the southwestern US, you will see this transformation immediately. So how can we actually minimize domestic and public water consumption? Sometimes estimations and some studies have shown it can be reduced by 50%. At least within the United States. Um, so you may want to here develop various sanitary and sewer systems that are not so much reliant on water, right, for the purpose of flushing and managing it, right. So you can use there are low volume toilets, where which requires flushing, but it doesn't require the same volume of water, right? And that has been implemented so far in Los Angeles, Orlando, Austin, Phoenix, particularly in areas that where water is expensive or becoming a commodity. They actually implemented this in many public places. And for gardening systems, there are waterless composting, where the composting process itself generates enough moisture to support the demand for water, right? In home garden systems to farming systems that can be used. Um, and use of anaerobic digesters within um, and using, let me take a step back, using anaerobic digesters to produce methane gas from waste generation, right? So what is happening over here is actually, instead of just like getting rid of the sewage, you can actually keep that sewage and in closed circuit systems and let certain bacteria that are like anaerobic bacteria digest the sewage to produce methane gas, and then use that methane gas to as a fuel, as a to maybe generate electricity, maybe to support heating systems, right, or for purpose of cooking, things like that. Cannot be a major replacement, but can sort of supplement certain energetics that we demand today. Um, and what about recycling and reusing water that are considered wastewater, rather than directly putting it in the sewage system or the wastewater system? Why don't we reuse it? Um, you can purify sewage water, right, sewage effluent, by simply by letting it settle itself. You can get rid of most of the suspended stuff, right. um, in San Diego, Singapore City, and Queensland of Australia, they actually pump water from sewage systems, from sewage treatment plants, directly um, to drinking water reservoirs. And then what they do is, of course, it's not pumping it to drinking water reservoirs. They pump it to water treatment plants that undergoes multiple levels of tiers of water treatment, ultimately removing all toxins and nutrients from sewage water. Um, and recycled water, some of the sewage water can be, with very basic treatment levels or like storm water systems, you can use that for the purpose of cooling machineries, right. You can use that easily for industrial activities. You can use it for agriculture, right. Well, you might also ask, how about making water a more of a commodity? How about increasing the prices? Well, that might actually make people think about water. Like it might even drive a paradigm shift to consider water as a critical resource than something like a common good. Right now, it's too cheap. Don't know in the political environment how that will ramify into a major problem. And then privatization of water, rather than government, cities, or counties or states managing water. How about letting the private sector handle it? Well, that could be also, a possible way. These are two questions. I'm not saying those two are the solutions, but it could partially have some sort of a incentive. Well, at least partly, it could solve the problem. It could help to manage a critical resource that right now are not are taken for granted.